Good afternoon, and thank you for joining us. You are in, if you're not awake, wake up now, because I was a ninth grade teacher. I will wake you up. My name is Jane Oates, and I am delighted to be the president of Working Nation, a nonprofit founded by philanthropist Art Bilger, committed to telling the stories of solutions in the workforce space. And ladies and gentlemen, I have some solutions on this stage. So you are going to be blown away. Please join our discussion. Hopefully we'll have time for questions from the audience, if everyone is willing. Nothing like asking you in front of the audience.
We are.
We are going to discuss today the role of employers in helping to create economic mobility for their workers. And this is a topic that's often forgotten by everyone. So I'm going to ask each of the panelists to do a little quick introduction of themselves and to be shamelessly open in talking about their business. Please. My favorite governor, would you like to start?
Thank you, Jane. Free ad, is that the idea?
Free ad.
My name is Deval Patrick. I am the founder and a managing director of an impact investing fund called Double Impact at Bain Capital, which we launched 3 years ago after I joined the firm, 4 years ago after 8 years as your favorite governor.
As my favorite governor, that's right.
Of Massachusetts, the only elective office I have held. And I got interested in the notion of impact investing because I think that the scale of the challenges facing humankind, frankly, require every sector to be engaged, government and philanthropy to be sure, but also the private sector. And I think that there's a kind of a false choice we've been making between impact and return. And we're trying to demonstrate at scale by investing in lower middle market companies where we can generate both the private equity return and measurable impact, that's a choice that needn't be made and in fact shouldn't be made.
Thank you very much. Sure. Frank, hard act to follow.
Yeah.
But you have a great story to tell.
If not impossible, but we'll do our best. My name is Frank Britt. I'm the CEO of Penn Foster Education. We're an upskilling platform that focuses on what we describe as the new majority, which the Department of Labor would describe as the middle skilled workforce, which are commonly defined as people with a associate degree or less. We call it the new majority because those are folks, the 60–70% of the workforce that has had limited to no economic growth in their income in the last decade. And so we're an organization that thinks of ourselves as a social enterprise focused on income mobility. We power that through an upskilling platform that includes accredited education and a variety of enablers that help drive better outcomes for the learners. And we partner with leading employers and social sector partners to try to amplify social impact at scale. Last year we had about 75,000 adults complete our various programs, all with the end game of trying to have a better income potential and better employment.
Thank you so much. Kathy.
Hi, I'm Kathy Canfield, and I'm a vice president with EmployBridge, and we actually are the nation's largest industrial staffing company. So we go to market in logistics and warehouse and clerical, and we employ about 500,000 folks over the course of a year. So we are large enough now to Deval's point that we needed to do something about the skills gap that we were seeing every day. We had a lot of workers and we had a lot of job openings, but those two didn't match. And so we were lucky enough to find Penn Foster, or Penn Foster found us, I'm not sure. But we partnered with them almost a year and a half ago on career and skill development courses, and we now have over 20,000 associates enrolled in those courses. Again, with the same idea that not only can we help them financially with pay increases, but also long-term career paths with our customers.
Thank you so much. Zoe.
Yeah, I'm Zoe Weintraub, the Vice President of Partnerships for Guild Education. Work alongside with Penn Foster as well, but we help large Fortune 1000 or like-sized companies develop education programs for their employees, mostly focused on the front line. So on one side, we work with a corporation to develop a program that meets their business needs around thinking about recruitment, upskilling, retention, and promotion. And on the other side, we've built out a network of learning providers and academic partners and universities to ensure that we're creating marketplace of choice for those employers. And then on top of that, we've built the software to ensure that a company can track and monitor the program, measure the ROI, and that the universities understand what the access and opportunity is from a student perspective.
Thank you. So I'm going to pose a question, and I'll start with somebody, but please, everyone, feel free. Let's have a conversation and feel free to jump in. So one of the things that Working Nation always pushes is the speed at which things are changing in the workforce. And certainly it's bringing about words and phrases like skills gap, and certainly things that lead to economic mobility or the lack thereof. So I want to talk for a second from each of your perspectives, if you so choose, to tell us and the audience, and me certainly, a little bit about where you're seeing the changes in the needs of employers in terms of skills. So either how whole businesses are changing or how specific jobs within a company have a different skill set than they did even a few years ago.
I'll take a starting point. I mean, I think we think about our marketplace as both the learner and the enterprise. And so while those are the Venn diagram, they both have unique imperatives. On the employer side, we see increasing them seeking to rationalize the support systems they have around education, upskilling to a handful of organizations that have the scale, the scope, and can drive the return on investment and have the agility to continue to move at the pace of change that is required to work with the Fortune 1000. On the learner side, we're all keenly aware that there's acceleration of skill obsolescence, and that puts a tremendous amount of strain on those individuals to find themselves in a situation where they're economically vulnerable without some sort of action. So we are very mindful of changes happening in allied health, in skilled trades, in the retail sector, and what we seek to do is to meet the individual where they are in their career pathway and put them on a journey where they can move to the next place, which is sometimes vertically, but candidly and increasingly it's more laterally to be able to stay relevant in the employment marketplace. And so particularly in allied health, we see a dynamic where there's a pent-up demand for capacity. In contrast that to, say, skilled trades, where there's the so-called silver tsunami, where you have as many as 20 or 30% of the current workforce eligible for retirement. You have an acute and growing and looming problem for just having enough workers that have the skills. So each occupation is its own unique dynamic, and we try to stay in tune with the high growth ones, particularly around the middle skill population.
You go. Okay. I think to Frank's point, what we see, because we are across sort of multiple disciplines, is we've heard from our customers, if you'll identify the learner, we'll take care of the rest. And I think for us, we use Penn Foster to do just that. It's a totally volunteer program, and we wanted to remove barriers like their ability to take their education whenever and however that was. So regardless of shift, regardless of schedule, and also cost. So removed access and we removed cost. And then they got to self-identify. And so for us, that was the leading indicator by our customer is just find us a learner and we'll take care of the rest.
That's great.
Yeah, from our perspective, when we work with a company like a Disney or a Walmart, they know what jobs are open or that they can't fill. And so our goal is to think about how can the core competencies that they've identified they need someone to have when it comes to supply chain or cybersecurity, how do we bring that to the network of academic institutions or learning providers like Penn Foster that we work with so that the student has something that's directly applicable to their job. If they're studying at night after they've put their kids to bed or taking care of a parent, the next day when they're on the job or the next week, those skills directly map to their competencies. And so I think as companies continue to evolve and think about their open jobs or the jobs that they're likely to have in the future, that overlap between identifying those needed skills and the competencies is really important when we think about the partners and the academic institutions that we work with so that they can move more nimbly and so that student, and often similarly to the false choice, that the students or the employee is not making a false choice between workforce development and education, but there's actually a bridge between the two.
So Zoe, I'm going to stick with you for a second and say, what kinds of programs and delivery methods right now are you seeing as the most effective?
Yeah, so all of our partners have online. So distance learning is the most effective delivery method. I'd say the three things that both an employee or an employer might be concerned about is accessibility, affordability, and applicability. And those are kind of the three drivers. And then I'd say at the end, it's successful outcomes. So our students actually completing, their employees learning these skills. And so distance learning is the key so that all the partners we work with, they have to have robust online programs so that the student can do work after hours, they can do it in the morning, they can do it on their commute to work. And I think, one of our success stories that we have with Penn Foster is we had a student get their entire high school diploma on their iPhone. And we see that often, which is that a student doesn't have the barrier to entry to learning, and that's really important. And then I'd say the other piece that we do with a lot of our institutions is what we call corporate credit for training. So taking the workforce training that an L&D team has built out, whether it's on the front line for Chipotle, for example, if you're a crew member or if you're a kitchen manager or a service manager, you're going through a pretty robust set of training that should be quantified or valued in the market from that employee. And so I think in terms of what's a learning or a modality that's working, it's actually giving people the currency of college credit for their work-based training and ensuring that they can demonstrate that they've been successful previously and that they can be successful in this next learning endeavor.
That's terrific. Frank, I want to go to you for a second, and again, please jump in, but Penn Foster has been at the forefront of adult reskilling and adult education working with employers for decades. I hate to say this, for as long as I've been in public policy, Penn Foster has always been a leader. Tell me how you've used innovation, what you've done in the past few years to really reinvent yourself and keep yourself fresh.
Well, to build on the historical perspective, which is actually kind of good that you don't remember when it started because it started in 1890.
I know, I don't want to go back that far.
Okay, so we're glad.
Close, 1896 was my birthday.
Okay, well, I'm glad we're all sharing here together. But it is, I think, an accurate historical comment to say that the fellow Thomas Foster that started what we now call Penn Foster, used to be called the International Correspondence School, invented essentially distance-based learning. He just did it through a mail-based medium. And so if you fast forward to the 21st century, obviously it's a digital world, it's a digital experience, and it needs to be. What we stepped back and looked at maybe as many as 5 years ago was we weren't satisfied with the pace of innovation across the sector, and certainly not our own innovation. And so we decided that the best way to do that was to essentially put ourselves in the middle of two very powerful voices, the voice of the consumer and the voice of the employer, and to see if we could actually somehow thread the needle of being responsive to both. Because while you might imagine at the conceptual level they have the same aspirations, they do, but really they don't. The expectations of a Fortune 100 company in terms of everything from outcome goals to data transparency to various modalities of delivery is a very, very loud voice and a very compelling voice that compels us to respond and be a better organization. At the same time, when you have 200,000 learners of different types and sizes, from high school to career school to college, they have their own voice that you have to be responsive to. And so our bet, which we executed on or initiated about 5.5, 6 years ago, was if we could manage to run both a consumer learner-centric enterprise under the same roof of an organization that's trying to be a B2B account like an Oracle, IBM, DNA, if you could actually have those mutually coexist, you would actually accelerate the pace of innovation for the organization and emerge on the other side of it as a scaled provider that can be responsive to both ends of the value chain, both the learner and the employer. And I'd say we're in the top of the third inning of sort of understanding what that really means. But the reason it matters is it starts to manifest itself by sector. So for example, in the veterinary market, animal health is a very fast-growing field. We serve the 5 largest animal hospital chains, all billion-dollar organizations, and we have more vet technicians on the consumer side than basically 4 out of every 10 in the United States now go to Penn Foster. And we have that insight on both sides of the marketplace, and that allows us to do very novel things like we can curate work-based learning at scale across the United States and different geographies. So our thesis has been if you could manage to scale both the consumer dynamics and the enterprise dynamics and make those mutually coexist, you would accelerate innovation and have a different kind of flywheel effect than any of the traditional systems would allow.
Jane, can I just add to
absolutely.
one of the key gaps that I think Penn Foster is helping to cross is this connection between the learner and the employer. And I will say that from my experience in my old job, in 2008, we were talking about this a little bit at breakfast this morning. In 2008, when the bottom had fallen out of the economy, in Massachusetts, we had 170,000 people looking for work and 125,000 vacancies. And what employers were telling us is, you in this room won't be surprised, is that they couldn't find the people with the skills necessary for the jobs they had. And in trying to engage as a policymaker to solve that, we looked to the training tools and resources that were available to us, as you will know, most of which come to states through the federal government, and you have zero flexibility. Zero flexibility. So you can send that money to a workforce development center, and God bless them, they do great things, and they train, and people come in maybe and take that course, but whether that course actually leads to a job was a huge challenge for us, around which we could not, we wanted to, but we didn't have the latitude to, with those resources anyway, to meet it. And I think Penn Foster is one of the most exciting ways, is one of the reasons why we are, I think, your largest investor now.
Yes, sir.
In our fund.
Thank you.
Is one of the ways to help bridge that gap. And then if you add to that the silver tsunami, which we've known for a while was coming, the pace of change in the workforce generally on account of AI and a host of other factors, and frankly, the way that the recession, this last recession, emphasized to people their vulnerability and the stagnation that has been around for a long while, and the need to really deal with economic mobility. I think strategies like Penn Foster's and the clients of Penn Foster are enormously powerful.
I agree. I'm going to switch over here, Kathy, for a second, because I think most of us would not think of staffing agencies as engines of innovation. And I want to give you a minute to really dispel that myth, because I really believe it is a myth, but I would like to give you a chance to kind of tell the audience how you're innovating in terms of this whole process of educating employees and meeting employers' needs.
Well, first and foremost, it's all Penn Foster's fault. No, I'm kidding.
Exactly.
You know, we have this concept within EmployBridge we call better work life, right? And it's this idea that once you get to a certain size, we need associates and we need customers, but, you know, without sort of taking a look at that entire human being, we all lose, you know? And so even with this idea around education and what we refer to internally as our Better Work Life Academy, which is our partnership with Penn Foster, we find that life gets in the way. You know, they have a job with us for as long as they want it, and we're providing them free skilled education, and still they cannot complete, you know, and why? And it's things like, you can take every Penn Foster course we offer on their cell phone, but they don't have an unlimited data plan. So how do they do that? You know, they don't have alternatives for transportation and their childcare and their shelter. And so this idea is education is just a piece, and we as a company have chosen to look at their entire better work life and to lift them up. And so regardless of where the disparity is, we want to try to plug that hole and fix the underlying issue so that ultimately we can, you know, work and focus on their skills to ultimately create more income for them. And I think what we've found is we have to put ourselves between the associate and the customer and educate / force our customers to understand the reality of the hourly worker today. And it isn't just anymore, to your point, Governor, you know, it used to be that there were 50 more folks you know, outside waiting for that job opportunity, and those 50 are now 0. And so if we as companies and employers don't fix what's going on underneath and don't be transparent and talk openly about these social issues, then we can't fix and ultimately take care and, you know, create a more productive working environment. And so as a staffing customer and partner, sort of seeing all of this throughout the country, it is the exact same issue, employer after employer after employer. And so we use this concept of workplace stability. You know, if we can't create a stable work environment for them, then everything flows back, you know, into family stability and learning stability. And
Can I just build on that? You know, we, as you should assume, have a vice president of learning, and we're on a path to having a vice president of social capital, not instead of learning, but to complement, because we recognize that the learning and life are not separate, they're integrated. And so we need to provide an integrative experience that's mindful of that. And so the types of programs that we have piloted and will scale over time include things like scaling mentoring models, where you identify in your network your social capital support system, which then involves eventually activating our alumni, which would be among the largest in the country, and eventually our employer partners, It also includes health and wellness programs, including mental health services. It includes some level of legal services, because that gets in the way of real life. As Kathy mentioned, transportation, childcare is understood. And I think you'll see over time a much more expansive notion of what is the brand promise that a challenger brand in an emerging new category called workforce development has to stand up for and behind. Because what we're encountering now is a demonstrable trust deficit. The consumer does not believe that the education institution can deliver on all of its needs, and so it doesn't start, because the probability is they may not finish, because they recognize implicitly they don't have these other support systems they need. So someone has to intervene. Historically, the government has had some responsibility, but it's complicated and frankly not highly coordinated, and it puts a tremendous amount of burden on the individual to figure out how to connect the dots. And what we're suggesting is an institution of our scale and scope and others like ours, we should connect the dots for you, make it an integrative experience to complement the academics. And what we see when we do that is it amplifies academic outcomes, it amplifies confidence, it amplifies the momentum of learning, and ultimately translates into better earning potential. And so we have, why I said we're second or third inning is we got a lot of work ahead to figure out how to do that well, but that's where we're headed. And I think that's a different brand promise than the traditional model of why don't you take a class online and see whether you have a good outcome.
I love your humility.
Oh, I was going to dovetail off of the trust
No, I'm
component.
serious
That's
about
okay.
that. I mean, it makes me feel so good that you're so humble that you're saying we're only in the third inning. You know, that we still have so much more to do. There are not many companies with your degree of success and your longevity who would say that. And I think that really is something that should be applauded. I mean that, Frank. I'm sorry, Zoe. Go ahead.
No, it's okay. I think the trust component, Frank and I have talked about this a bit over the last couple of weeks. The trust component also is at the corporate level. So our partners have rolled out in the last year, I think, some pretty incredible programs. Walmart's paying 100% for the cost of education for their employees. Disney's covering it for hundreds of different programs for their employees. And there's this sense of distrust because employees or frontline workers distrust higher education. They've been in school before and they haven't completed and they still have debt. And so this idea that the company itself is potentially paying 100%, they're asking what's the catch. And I think our team often gets this from their frontline employees. And a lot of it actually, I think, will come down to, is the company going to choose to be transparent about their intention? So Taco Bell, for example, says, start with us, stay with us. Their intention is someone could start their career with them and leave, or they could stay with them and grow it. And I think when we think about where companies are investing in automation, there is somewhat of a moral imperative at the corporate level to provide an education program that will set up their frontline employees for success for what that career looks like today, or what that career looks like in 3 to 5 to 10 years from now. But they have to be honest with that, which is, you can grow your career here and stay, or you can leave. But the employee, in order to take advantage of that and to complete, to your point, needs to know what that path looks like for them. And a company has, I think, the opportunity to really take charge of that narrative.
That's terrific. Yeah.
I was just
Kathy,
going to say,
sure.
from a transparency perspective, we use Net Promoter Score within our organization, and we monitor our associates' view of their experience with us. And one of the things we've been able to see is in our locations, we have over 500 across the country, when our teams put the associate first, even sometimes before our customers, no customers in the room, I hope, but we actually see double-digit revenue growth for branches who take care of our associates first, and sometimes over associates. And the key there is we're building trust and loyalty. They're as loyal as they come, and they'll actually even take a poor assignment because of how we took care of them. And they trust that we'll take care of them on the next assignment. And so for us, it's really sort of moving a very large ship, but refocusing that those associates have a lot more power than they think they do sometimes, and that we're communicating with them that they actually do, and they should rise up and take full advantage of that.
Oh, that's great. And I want to remind you, please take the opportunity to ask a question. There's a microphone in the middle of the aisle here. I'll keep my eye on there, and if you get up, I'll stop my talking. But you opened the window for me, Frank, to talk about government. And certainly, Governor, I want to start
Well,
with
he
you.
opened the window, ask him.
Well, but you mentioned it too, and besides, I've known you longer than I've known him. But I think the question I want to ask is specifically, what is government's responsibility to employers in this realm? Because the $5,250, the $5,250 that we all know, has not changed. That's the tax benefit that employers can take for giving educational benefits to their employees. Has not changed since it was put in tax law in 1982. 82. Think about how college tuition, cost of delivering non-collegiate education, how that's increased
Well,
since
and
then.
think about what else gets a tax benefit or some other kind of incentive compared to what the long-term personal and social impact is of preparing people in all the ways we've been talking about, in terms of hard skills and so-called social skills. I think that government has a role. I am because I have a view about using the tax system to incentivize behavior. I am not convinced, by the way, that is the best way.
Interesting.
That is the best way. Most of the time, I think companies that make decisions on because of the tax break is a company on the way out of business. But
Jeff Bezos just had a heart attack.
I don't know all the factors in his decision, but from my experience in other large companies, that cannot be the centerpiece of the decision if you're thinking out beyond the first quarter or two. I do think this is another thing that came up this morning in our breakfast. There is one of the other guests brought it up. The lives of people, meeting their needs and supporting their ability to have real economic mobility, depends on education and skills development and other things. Meaning, can you get to the job?
Yes.
Can you afford to live in the community around the job? Is it safe? I mean, most citizens, in my view, don't see themselves as a part of a program. They don't look at government as, you can do that bit for me. But, they look at a whole, as I used to talk about people landing at Logan Airport in Boston. They, get on a bus, maybe to the water ferry, and then the water ferry across to downtown, and they walk to South Station. They might get a train out to a suburb and pick up their car in a lot there. They're not thinking about which agency is responsible for which part of that trip. They want the whole thing to be seamless and safe and affordable. And I think more and more as policymakers, we have to encourage that kind of thinking. We have to think about how do you think of infrastructure in its broadest sense? What are the things that the public does to enable individual and business to actualize their ambitions?
Thank you. I see a question. Yes, ma'am.
Hi.
Hi.
What happens when the economy takes its inevitable downturn? What can we expect employers to be doing? Are they going to continue to really be investing? Even right now, most of the best, only a certain fraction of the companies are paying for tuition benefits at this point. Staffing companies are doing this because they're being driven to do it by the demands. But when the economy takes a hit, what happens to this whole ecosystem?
Excellent question.
Love
Thank you.
that.
I'll start.
Please, yeah.
Sure. So we think about that a lot. I think there's a few factors that'll come into play, and then the dovetail or the tail end is around consumer brands and how the consumer market shapes decisions companies will make. But on the front side, it's been proven that they can increase retention and they can increase recruitment as well as promotion rates for their employees. So if that continues to happen, the business case or the ROI for the company to do it is there. And even if competition is not as tight from a labor market perspective, growing and developing that employee base will still be a core function of the HR, the L&D teams. And so I think the business opportunity will continue to be strong. On the flip side, though, I think the consumer brands, I mean, a lot of the companies we work with, and I would say that many that Penn Foster works with as well, are consumer or consumer facing. And so it matters to their customers how they treat their employees. And so even in a downturn, that will affect the way that they think about these benefits and how longstanding they are. My plug on the 5250, though, is that definitely needs to increase and it needs to broaden for the different forms of employment relationships that exist. Today, it doesn't cover gig economy workers. It doesn't cover 1099. And so when we think about different downturns in the economy, that cycle, the Uber and Lyfts of the world came out during that period of time, as did the rise of Upwork or shift style work that were gig based. And so how do we ensure that education benefits or upskilling opportunities, we can still create incentives for companies or for platforms or marketplaces to pave the way for that. And right now, the current tax code and system isn't set up for that in a boom or a bust cycle.
I mean, you know the answer yourself that historically speaking, during downturns, enrollments in education enterprises typically grow. So it's a counter-cyclical sector. Yes, often that's the case. In the middle skilled market, though, there's a new notion emerging, which is that part of the value proposition to have a middle skilled workforce is in contrast to what was always the case for the white collar knowledge worker who had access to tuition reimbursement. There's never been that access historically for the middle skilled workforce. And so as we think about the way the value proposition for leading employers is emerging, they're recognizing that they need to drive a variety of new ways to think about the relationship and the social contract with that individual. And I think it's a systemic change in how people think about labor and think about talent. It's not just driven by macroeconomics. Now, if it's a black swan kind of dynamic, of course, that's a different set of conditions. But in general, if you have kind of what you might call rational economic pullback, rational economic growth, we fundamentally believe and are supporting the idea that this is the new normal. The expectation is that that's part of the value proposition that you have if you want to attract the best and the brightest of the middle skilled population, as has always been the premise for the knowledge workers. And we see strong saline effects these are long-term commitments that these employers are making. These are not just tied to the near-term issue of temporary shortage of workers.
Can I just make one other point? I know you have a question, but just really quickly, I think another important component of the answer is driving down the price point for that training, so it is truly as accessible as possible for the worker who doesn't have an employer who picks up the tab, or for a worker who does today but might not tomorrow.
Good point.
No, I think that's great. And I would take moderator's privilege just for 1 second and thank you, Goldie, for your reporting, because you've been really brave in talking about all aspects of this issue from the higher ed point. So thank you very much for everything that you continue to do. We want you to keep pushing. So thank you. Sir, and for people who don't know, it's tough to be a reporter for something called the Chronicle of Higher Ed and not be in their pocket. And she does it every day. She says it fairly. Sir, question.
Subscribe to her newsletter. You don't have to be a subscriber to the Chronicle, although she'd appreciate it if you were. But you can subscribe to her newsletter, Goldie Standard.
Wow.
I like it. It's a little more pithy than the Chronicle itself, but it's a really good, succinct read. I've been to a bunch of GSVs, and not all 10. But one of the things that I found most rewarding, that I would imagine that you find rewarding, is this acknowledgement that not every success story must start with a 4-year degree. Right. And that really has changed since maybe the first one I was at, which was eight years ago. But other than this attention that's been given to CTE, that really began in earnest in the Obama administration with significant investments in and around not only just the role of community colleges, but CTE itself, there hasn't been a whole lot of federal movement. Zoe pointed out the level funding of Pell. We haven't gotten innovative about how to apply that to some of your programs and others. And so I wanted to take what audience prerogative, given, Jane, your background in DC, and I'll even pull you in, Kathy, given the fact that you employ 500,000 people, I imagine that there's someone at EmployBridge that can get someone in DC on the phone when they'd like to. To pull further just on the point that you made, but what are we not seeing that we should be seeing from DC in particular around legislation to better support how employers can drive economic mobility? Because we'll all benefit from their ability to do so. How can we ease that friction?
Great question.
Do you want to answer that?
Well, I think the authorizing language is great. I think where we've been very weak, I think the new Perkins bill is terrific. I think the new WIOA has all the right language in there. The problem is it's underfunded. I mean, it took us a long time to convince Congress that the 15% for governors should be back in. Governors need flexibility with that money so that they can innovate throughout the state. But I would really open it to you guys. I mean, I certainly am a nerd on this stuff, and I think I think the authorizers and the appropriators need to get together and adequately fund, just like I think they need to adequately fund other things. I mean, I think Pell is very short of where it should be, and while I think it should be expanded year-round and should be for programs like high school completion as well as college going, you cannot get a baccalaureate degree if you don't have a high school diploma, period. You know, I mean, so why wouldn't you help with that? And now with some of the retirements that are coming, I don't know who the champions for that are going to be. You know, I mean, we have very weak leadership, and of course my heart is still broken because of the loss of my mentor, Senator Kennedy. But I want somebody to replace him quickly. So, but I'd love to hear your remarks about that.
Yeah, well, I'll start with 5250. It should obviously go up. No question about that. If you account for inflation, it should be at about $12,000 today, and that doesn't account for the rising cost of tuition. And with an increasing number of companies actually taking note of wanting to pay for 100% or a large percentage of a degree, why not raise that as quickly as possible? So I think that's one. And then two is in the cases where you do have a Walmart or a Disney or Discover that's paying for their employees to fully go to school, there's the gross up. So what's over 5250, that's a commitment that the employee then has to make in a frontline worker role that might hit them at the end of the year when they don't actually have a paycheck to cover it. So maybe
for Goldie as my employee, above and beyond that Goldie has to adjust her taxes and count that as payment. So even though she got the benefit of it, so the bridging that gap, I think, is important as well, so she's not penalized for taking advantage of that.
Well, and if Goldie was a frontline worker, it's most likely that she would have $400 or approximately in her bank account to cover that cost. So I think that's a really key and important part about how the programs are designed or how corporations think about it and what needs to be done to increase that dollar amount. I could continue, but I think the other piece too, before I hand it over to you, is on the gig economy piece or flexible forms of employment. Right now, they're only covered under 132 in the tax code, not under 127, which is the one that we're kind of all talking about. And therefore, there aren't as many opportunities for them to upskill. And I think we hear it often, which is the marketplaces of the world, the Airbnbs, the Lyft, the Uber, the Instacart. How can we build programs that look more like your programs? And there are limitations. And so I think that's another change that would serve us all well.
I would just say quickly, from an employer perspective, like WIOA funding and even apprenticeships and some of the stuff that's opening up just a little bit, as the person who has to wade through some of this, there's nothing simple about it. There's nothing easy about it. Even as a large employer, trying to get a straight answer from someone who can make a decision is incredibly frustrating. And so, in states even that I think are very employer friendly, like Indiana and Kentucky, it is tough to get through to this funding to ultimately help our workers. And so that's why you find folks like us going to Penn Foster and doing it on our own, because it's fast, it's easy, and we can help our associates and our customers faster. I will say, that said, we have partnered with the Department of Labor and have the first national staffing apprenticeship that has ever been founded. So we successfully worked through that landscape, but it wasn't easy. And I think that, as Governor Patrick said, it's hard to recognize that you have a problem and a potential solution, and employers are even willing to participate, but you can't because of all the rules and regulations. And so as a large employer, we said we'll do it on our own, and sometimes that's great, but it doesn't ultimately affect the change you're describing, which doesn't help in that scenario. So it helps our folks, but not all.
We are out of time, but I'm still going to ask everybody one lightning round question. If you had a magic wand, and could change one thing to really impact helping employers increase the economic mobility of their employees, what would you do?
Start down.
So well, I'm just back to something I said earlier. I would, at a minimum, give maximum flexibility to the use of those training dollars that come out of Washington into the states.
I think the battleground conversation is about how do you reassign risk in the new discussion about upskilling. Because the traditional model assumes that the institution is de-risked and the individual takes on the risk. And then sometimes you have enlightened employers who decide to do their workers a favor. And I think that's a fundamentally flawed calculus. And I think that's driven by the fact that there's inefficiencies in the system and the institutions can't de-layer their cost structures to allow an affordable solution for the individual. And so they ask the individual to take on that responsibility. And we all know what happened as a result of that story. So what we see happening is the new conversations that are emerging with both the thoughtful incumbent providers and sort of the challenger brands that are emerging is a new conversation about how risk should be reassigned in the context of the learner, the employer, and government. And I think if we were to have this meeting 2 or 3 years from now, you'll see a lot different conversation around how that risk gets allocated and reassigned with different kind of incentive systems. And I think the reason I'm very bullish about the workforce development economy being contemporized is because I see risk now starting to become part of the conversation in a way that is very tangible to all the primary stakeholders, and it's not going to be the same answer as the one that we've had for the last 30 years.
Kathy?
I would say probably reward the learner. You know, not even necessarily the completer, but the person who's indicated that they want to learn and they want to develop skills. You know, our biggest conversation with our clients today is, you know, we're not asking for mobility for all 1,000 associates we have at your facility, but we're asking for the mobility for the 100 who said, pick me. You know, I don't know exactly how I'm going to complete this course, but I'm learning things along the way and there's value in that. And so, hey, customer, let's focus on these 100 and recognize them and talk about them and propel them forward. And then we can talk about the other 900. So, you know, recognize and reward the learner.
Shamelessly, I think all companies should offer education as a benefit. But if
And
we
through
were,
Guild, right?
I mean, yeah. No, but let's usher in the new era of benefits. Healthcare did it. Let's do it with education. Let's make it a right of every employee that goes to work at whatever age they're at. And that would be the ask that I think would actually really move the needle.
Please join me in thanking this tremendous panel. Thank you so much.